Well, welcome back to Cardboard Swords, and finally another instalment of the Jank Bank. The drone of Brutality unbanning has definitely made some waves, and we're going to try and abuse its power in Riptide. It's Dronetide. Let's get in. Well, Riptide is the new ranger from Outsiders, and he managed to pick up 10 living legend points last skirmish season. His hero ability allows you to reload every time you play a card from hand. As well as that, whenever you trigger a trap, you'll deal 1 damage to the opposing hero. Now, most of those builds that got living legend points ran Talishar, and they were fairly aggressive lists. Now, we're running Talishar in this list too, but aggression is not the aim of the game. Instead, we're going to abuse the power of Drone of Brutality, which always goes to the bottom of your deck. So we want to batten down the hatches, weather the storm, and get to the inevitable strong late game. Now, as this deck is one in our UPF Battle Box series, we've tried to keep the equipment as cheap as possible. If you've got an Arcanite Skullcap, then run it. But if not, Ironhide will do just fine. The deck really struggles to do without the Trench of Sunken Treasure though. The Trench allows you to gain a resource, but more importantly it frees up your arsenal, meaning you could do some tricky shenanigans to get around things like Dominate. And to be honest, the Trench could be considered pretty budget these days, coming in at around £25. In the sideboard we're rocking some Null Rune, although we've got to hope we don't come up against any wizards, because if we do, that matchup ain't going to go well. Mask of Malicious Manifestations is a card that's worth thinking about. We're not running very many attack actions in this deck, and this is one way that we are able to go and fetch one if we need one. It might just be complete jank, in which case, get it in the list. The whole aim of this deck is to work towards an inevitable endgame that's as sure as the tide, utilising Drone of Brutality's power. Now, these were initially banned because there's very little downside for using them. You block with them, they end up back on your deck. You attack with them, they end up back in your deck. This means that we'll enter the late game with a high density of breakpoint attacks, whereas our opponents will have already been bled dry. The only other attack we're running in this deck is Nourishing Emptiness, because again, there's very little downside to doing so. Given that there will never be any attack actions in our graveyard, we'll always get the +1 intelligence and dominate. And we're also packing a couple of copies of Pummel to target either the Nourishing Emptiness or the Drone of Brutality. Make them discard a card, force some damage, and multiply the misery. But in order to navigate the choppy waters and get through to our late game, we need to have a pretty strong defensive package. Sink Below blocks 4 helps us cycle through our deck. Fate Foreseen blocks 4 helps us cycle through our deck, and if we play one of our D-Reacts from hand, we can use Riptide's ability to load in the Springboard Somersault, and that's also going to block for 4. We're also running a little bit of life gain in the way of Oasis Respite and Sigil of Solace. We can use the Trench to gain a resource to play Oasis Respite from hand. We can then use Riptide to put Springboard Somersault into arsenal ready for the next attack. And it's lines like this that can give us a lot of value in our defensive play. But as well as a strong defensive game, we also want to be chipping away at our opponent's life total. Traps are a pretty good way to do this, and Riptide's ability will deal 1 damage to our opponent whenever the criteria on the trap has been met. Now, the criteria is easier to meet on some than it is others. Plenty of decks run attacks with Go Again, or attacks that are buffed, but decks that run lots of attack reactions are fewer and far between. But when you do trigger a trap, particularly one of the specialisations, it's glorious. We're also running some of the original Crucible of War traps, the ones that must be played from Arsenal. Getting them into Arsenal shouldn't be an issue with Riptide's ability, and these ones will trigger every time, giving us extra value. Looking at the deck stats, and we've got 9 blue pitch cards, which makes us pretty susceptible to Ice Disruption or Arcane. We've got D-Reacts for days, and 19 of those are traps. 19 traps doesn't mean 19 damage though, because getting them all to trigger is pretty impossible. So there you have it. Dronetide. Now I'm going to be doing some playing around with this. I might take out the Nourishing Emptiness in favour of a 0 cost arrows package. Now these all block 3, so they can still do a job defensively, but they allow you to be a bit more punchy on the swing back. And the bow of choice for this will probably be the Barbed Castaway. Dronetide is the second deck that's been added to our UPF Battle Box series. It adds a whole new dimension to gameplay when no one really wants to attack the guy who might deal damage when they defend. What's more, if you do decide to run the Barbed Castaway, you can flip a particularly nasty trap face up to deter off would-be attackers. There's lots of room for experimentation and plenty more work to be done on the deck. I'm going to be playing this one soon on camera, so like, subscribe, and we'll see you then.